The morning sun cast long shadows across the outdoor shooting range at Camp Pendleton. The air carried the crisp scent of ocean salt mixed with the metallic tang of gun oil and powder. For the Marines of Delta Company, this was more than just another qualification day. Today, they would prove themselves worthy of the title they carried. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reeves stood tall at 6'2", his weather-beaten face scanning the line of 23 young Marines preparing their weapons. At 35, Reeves had seen enough combat across 3 tours in Afghanistan to know the difference between range scores and combat effectiveness. His dark eyes, perpetually narrowed from years of desert sun, missed nothing as he watched his charges. "Listen up, Marines," Reeves called out, his voice carrying over the general murmur of the group. "Today isn't just about qualification. We have visitors from the Pentagon observing. Show them what Delta Company can do." The Marines straightened almost imperceptibly at the news. Pentagon observers meant visibility, and visibility meant potential advancement. The air suddenly charged with a new current of electricity. Private First Class Jack Reynolds checked his M4A1 SOPMOD Block 2 with practiced precision. At 19, the Texas native was the youngest in the platoon, but carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he'd already mastered his craft. His fingers moved over the rifle with casual confidence, adjusting the advanced combat optical gun sight with a familiarity born of countless hours of practice. "This new ACOG is sweet," Reynolds said to no one in particular, his voice carrying just enough to ensure others would hear. 4-power magnification bullet drop compensator calibrated for 5.56 NATO. I could hit a playing card at 600 yards with this setup. Several Marines around him smirked or nodded in agreement. Their gear represented the pinnacle of modern military technology: advanced optics, laser designators, lightweight components, and ammunition designed by ballistics experts with supercomputers. In their hands rested the culmination of billions in research and development. "Yeah," replied Corporal Miguel Sanchez, inspecting his own weapon. "These rifles make it almost too easy. My grandfather used to talk about qualifying with iron sights." "Can you imagine?" Reynolds laughed. "Probably why they lost Vietnam." The comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles. Staff Sergeant Reeves frowned but said nothing. Some lessons couldn't be taught in a classroom. At the far end of the firing line, a commotion drew attention. A civilian pickup truck had pulled into the parking area, and from it emerged a solitary figure that seemed oddly out of place in this temple of modern warfare. The Marines watched with curiosity as an elderly man made his way slowly but purposefully toward the range. He walked with a slight limp but maintained a straight posture that hinted at military background. The stranger wore simple clothing, faded jeans, a plain navy blue button-down shirt, and a weathered baseball cap, bearing the embroidered insignia of the Army Special Forces. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't his age or his gait. It was what he carried. In his weathered hands was a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a modern firing range. The polished wood stock gleamed with the patina that only decades of careful maintenance could produce. The distinctive profile was unmistakable to anyone with knowledge of military firearms history. "Holy shit," whispered Reynolds, nudging Sanchez. "Is that a Garand like an actual World War II M1 Garand?" The old man seemed oblivious to the stares as he set up at an empty firing position. From a small leather case, he removed ammunition that looked nothing like the standard 5.56mm rounds the Marines were using. The brass casings had a dull patina that spoke of hand-loading and careful preparation. Staff Sergeant Reeves approached the elderly shooter with professional courtesy, though his eyes betrayed curiosity about both the man and his vintage weapon. "Good morning, sir. I need to check your range card and identification. This is an active military training area." The old man looked up, his eyes clear and sharp despite the wrinkles that framed them. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. "Morning, Sergeant," he replied, his voice steady and respectful. "James Coleman, I have the necessary clearance." He handed over a military ID card that made Reeves raise an eyebrow. The card was current but indicated decades of service. "Master Sergeant James Coleman, U.S. Army Special Forces, retired," Reeves read aloud. "Service dates 1966 to 1996. He studied the ID more carefully. "Green Beret, 5th Special Forces Group." "That's right," Coleman confirmed quietly. Reeves handed the ID back with newfound respect. "That's an original M1 Garand you're shooting today." Coleman nodded, running his hand along the stock with the affection one might show a faithful dog. Springfield Armory, 1943 production. Been with me longer than most marriages last. By now, several young Marines had drifted closer, drawn by curiosity about this relic from another era of warfare. "No offense, Sergeant Coleman," Reynolds said, unable to contain himself. "But are you sure that old gun is safe to fire? Looks like it might belong in a museum, not on a live range." A few Marines snickered. Coleman didn't seem bothered by the comment. Instead, he smiled patiently, continuing to prepare his position. "She's been reliable for almost 8 decades," he replied. "I suspect she's got a few more rounds in her." "Yeah, but can you even see the targets from here?" Another Marine asked, pointing toward the 600-yard line where their qualification would take place. "Those are some pretty distant targets for iron sights." Coleman looked up, his eyes twinkling with something between amusement and challenge. "My eyes work just fine for what needs seeing, son." Reeves watched the interaction with interest. He'd spent enough time around special operations veterans to know that appearances could be deceptive. The old man's calm demeanor and precise movements spoke volumes. "What brings you to our range today, Master Sergeant?" Reeves asked. Coleman finished loading his rifle with 8 rounds, the distinctive ping of the Garands and block clip locking into place. The sound was foreign to the young Marines who had grown up in the era of detachable box magazines. "Keeping the rust off," Coleman replied simply. "Been shooting this course once a month since I retired. Helps keep the fundamentals sharp." Reynolds couldn't help himself. "Fundamentals. No offense, sir, but modern combat shooting has evolved a bit since that rifle was new." Coleman looked at the young Marine for a long moment before responding. "Some things change, son. Some don't." Before Reynolds could reply, the range officer called out, "Range is hot in 2 minutes. Shooters to your positions." The Marines moved to their assigned spots, checking their modern rifles one last time, adjusting their optics and inserting magazines. Coleman took his position at the end of the line, assuming a textbook prone position with a small sandbag supporting the forend of his Garand. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic in their precision. Reeves noticed something odd about Coleman's preparation. While the young Marines continued fidgeting with their equipment, adjusting straps and rechecking settings, Coleman had become completely still. There was an economy to his movement that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. "Range is hot. Commence fire." The command echoed across the landscape. Immediately, the firing line erupted with the sharp staccato reports of M4 carbines. The Marines engaged targets appearing at various distances from 100 yards out to the maximum 600 yards. Their rifles chattered in controlled bursts, the sound exactly what you'd expect from modern military firearms. Efficient, technological, almost clinical in their precision. But cutting through that contemporary symphony came a different sound entirely. Boom, the deep, authoritative report of the M1 Garand was unmistakable. Then another. Boom. Each shot from Coleman's position was deliberate, measured, separated by several seconds of complete stillness. While the Marines were firing rapidly, trying to hit as many targets as possible in the allotted time, Coleman was taking his time, following a rhythm established decades before any of these young Marines were born. Breathe, aim, squeeze, follow through. Reynolds found his attention divided between his own targets and the peculiar shooting style of the old man. Despite his earlier mockery, there was something compelling about the methodical approach. Each time that vintage Garand spoke, Reynolds could hear a metallic clang echoing back from the target line. Every single shot was finding its mark. The young Marines began to notice that despite their rapid fire and advanced optics, they weren't hearing the satisfying indication of hits nearly as often as they'd expected. Meanwhile, every time Coleman's rifle barked that distinct sound of lead striking steel, followed with unerring consistency. "Cease fire, clear and safe all weapons." The range officer's command brought the qualification session to an end. As the Marines safed their weapons, conversation bubbled up along the firing line, most of it centered around self-assessment and expectations. Staff Sergeant Reeves, however, had retrieved a pair of high-powered binoculars and was studying the target area with intense concentration. "Range detail, bring in targets for scoring," the range officer ordered. A crew moved downrange to collect the paper silhouettes that would determine qualification scores. When the targets returned, Reeves immediately sought out Coleman's. What he saw made him call for the range safety officer immediately. "Sir, you need to see this," Reeves said, pointing toward Coleman's target set. The range safety officer, a grizzled gunnery sergeant with 20 years of experience, took the targets and spread them on the scoring table. His reaction was immediate. "Jesus Christ," he muttered loud enough for nearby Marines to hear. The young shooters gathered around as the range personnel displayed Coleman's targets for scoring. A hush fell over the group that had been joking and laughing just minutes before. Every single target from 100 yards out to the maximum 600-yard line showed the same pattern. Perfect center mass hits grouped so tightly you could cover them with a playing card. But it wasn't just the accuracy that stunned everyone. It was the precision. While the Marines with their advanced optics and modern ammunition had scattered shots across their targets in generally acceptable groupings, Coleman had put every single round exactly where it would do the most damage to an enemy. The difference was stark and undeniable. The 600-yard target told the most incredible story. At that distance, most of the young Marines had struggled to hit the silhouette at all, even with their scoped rifles. Coleman had put 8 rounds through the center in a group so tight it looked like someone had used a precision shooting rest. "That's impossible," one of the Marines whispered. "Nobody shoots that well with iron sights, especially not at that age." But there was the evidence holes punched through paper with mechanical precision. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Among them was a distinguished-looking officer wearing the insignia of a full colonel. The name tape on his uniform read Wilson. He'd been observing from the range tower as part of the Pentagon delegation. "May I?" Colonel Wilson asked, reaching for Coleman's rifle. The old veteran handed it over without hesitation. Wilson examined the weapon with the appreciation of a connoisseur. He checked the sights, the action, the wear patterns on the metal. Everything spoke of meticulous care and regular use. This was no safe queen or collector's piece. This was a working rifle that had been maintained to the highest standard for decades. "Original sights?" Wilson asked. Coleman nodded. "Never saw the need to change what works." "And the ammunition?" "Hand-loaded, 168-grain Sierra Match King bullet, Lake City brass from the 1970s, IMR 464 powder. Been using the same load recipe for 40 years. Wilson returned the rifle with a nod of respect. "That's remarkable shooting, Master Sergeant. I don't think I've seen groups that tight at 600 yards, even with modern precision rifles." Reynolds couldn't contain himself any longer. The cognitive dissonance between his expectations and the reality before him needed resolution. "Sir," he addressed Coleman, his earlier mockery replaced with genuine curiosity. "How did you do that? I mean, we have all this technology, computerized ballistics, match-grade barrels, optical sights, and you just outshot all of us with something my grandfather might have used." Coleman looked around at the circle of young faces now watching him intently. Their expressions had transformed from amusement to something approaching awe. "You want to know the real difference between your shooting and mine?" Coleman asked. The Marines nodded eagerly. "You were all trying to hit targets," Coleman said simply. "I was trying to stop threats." The distinction seemed subtle, but Coleman continued. "Every time you pulled that trigger, you were thinking about scores, about qualification standards, about impressing your buddies or that colonel over there." He nodded toward Wilson. "Every time I pulled mine, I was remembering faces." The range went completely quiet. "Faces?" asked Staff Sergeant Reeves. Coleman stood slowly, his rifle now cased and secured. "In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, my team was inserted deep into Iraqi territory to gather intelligence on Republican Guard movements. We were compromised and came under heavy fire. A sniper had us pinned down from about 800 yards out." The Marines listened with rapt attention, the earlier mockery completely forgotten. Dust storm was kicking up. Visibility was poor. Wind gusting to 15 miles per hour. I had one shot to neutralize that threat before he picked off more of my men. "Did you get him?" Reynolds asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "One shot, 800 yards, iron sights, variable wind conditions." Coleman nodded. "Threat eliminated." But that wasn't the end of the story. Over 30 years of service, I took 47 lives at ranges from 100 to 1,000 yards. Every single shot was to save American lives. Every single shot mattered more than any qualification target ever will. The weight of his words settled over the young Marines like a heavy blanket. They were beginning to understand that they weren't just looking at an old man with an antique rifle. They were in the presence of someone who had lived the skills they were only beginning to learn. The reason I can outshoot all of you, Coleman continued, isn't because I'm more talented or because I have some secret technique. It's because when I learned to shoot, missing meant my brothers died. You've been training to pass a test. I was training to come home alive. Staff Sergeant Reeves found his voice first. Master Sergeant Coleman, with all due respect, why didn't you tell us who you were when you first arrived? Coleman shouldered his rifle case. Because it shouldn't matter who I am. What should matter is what you can learn. He began walking toward the parking area, his slight limp more noticeable now after the time spent on the ground. But Reynolds called out after him. Master Sergeant Coleman, could you maybe teach us? Show us how to shoot like that? Coleman stopped and turned back. For the first time that day, he smiled broadly, the expression transforming his weathered face. Son, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to ask me that question. Colonel Wilson stepped forward then. Master Sergeant Coleman, I'd like to discuss something with you. The Pentagon has been developing a new training initiative aimed at preserving the hard-won knowledge of veterans like yourself. Would you be interested in hearing more about it? Coleman looked at the eager faces of the young Marines, then back at Wilson. I believe I would, Colonel. Reynolds watched the exchange with growing excitement. Something important was happening here, something that transcended the normal routine of military training. The young Marine couldn't articulate it yet, but he sensed that this chance encounter with an old warrior and his ancient rifle might change everything. As Coleman and Wilson walked away deep in conversation, Reeves gathered his Marines. Let that be your first lesson, he told them. Never judge a warrior by his weapon or his age. Judge him by his results. The Marines nodded, their earlier bravado replaced by thoughtful reflection. Reynolds looked down at his high-tech rifle with its advanced optics and accessory rails. For the first time, he wondered if having the best equipment had made him a better shooter or merely convinced him he was one. 3 days later, Delta Company assembled at the range again. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Word had spread throughout the base about the old Green Beret who had outshot an entire company of Marines with a World War II rifle. What had started as an object of mockery had become a legend overnight. When Coleman arrived, he wasn't alone. Colonel Wilson accompanied him along with several other senior officers. This was no longer an informal shooting session. It had the hallmarks of an official military program. Marines, Colonel Wilson addressed the assembled company. Today marks the beginning of the Warrior Legacy program. Master Sergeant Coleman has agreed to serve as our first instructor in this initiative aimed at preserving the institutional knowledge and combat skills developed through decades of real-world experience. The Marines straightened to attention. This was unexpected, but intriguing. I want to be clear, Wilson continued. This isn't about rejecting modern technology or training methods. It's about supplementing them with fundamental skills that have proven effective across generations of combat. Skills that don't rely on batteries or electronics. Skills that might save your lives when technology fails. Coleman stepped forward, his weathered M1 Garand cradled in his arms like an old friend. First lesson, he announced, his voice stronger and more commanding than it had been during his first visit. A rifle is not a weapon until it's in the hands of a warrior. In the hands of anyone else, it's just a machine that makes noise. Reynolds found himself nodding in agreement. 3 days ago, he would have scoffed at such a statement. Now he understood the profound truth behind it. Today we're going back to basics, Coleman continued. No optics, no laser sights, iron sights only. I want you to feel your weapons, not just operate them. Several Marines exchanged glances. This was a radical departure from their normal training regime. Staff Sergeant Reeves will demonstrate, Coleman said, gesturing for Reeves to step forward. Reeves approached carrying a standard-issue M4 carbine that had been stripped of all its accessories. No optic, no vertical grip, no tactical light, just the basic rifle with iron sights. The fundamentals never change, Coleman explained as Reeves assumed a prone position. Breathing, relaxation, sighted alignment, trigger control. These principles have remained constant from muskets to machine guns. For the next hour, Coleman walked the Marines through breathing exercises and body positioning techniques that few of them had ever encountered in their formal training. He explained the relationship between heart rate and accuracy, demonstrating how controlled breathing could steady both the body and the mind. Reynolds absorbed every word, every demonstration with intense concentration. This was unlike any marksmanship instruction he'd ever received. Coleman wasn't just teaching them how to shoot, he was teaching them how to become one with their weapons. The human element is what separates a shooter from a marksman, Coleman explained. Any computer can calculate bullet drop and wind drift. Only a human can adapt to the thousand variables that exist outside the mathematical models. As the session progressed, a figure appeared at the edge of the range. A tall, stern-looking officer with the rank of lieutenant and the bearing of someone who believed firmly in his own importance. His name tape read Peterson. Lieutenant Scott Peterson watched the proceedings with growing displeasure. As the company's designated marksmanship instructor, he had developed a training program based entirely on modern techniques and technology. What he was witnessing appeared to be a step backward in his eyes. "Colonel Wilson," Peterson called out as he approached, "what exactly was going on here? These Marines are scheduled for advanced optics training this afternoon." Wilson turned to face the newcomer. "Lieutenant Peterson, perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Master Sergeant James Coleman, our new advisory instructor for the Warrior Legacy program." Peterson's expression made it clear he was not impressed. "With all due respect, sir, we have a standardized training curriculum that's been developed based on combat data from Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not sure how techniques from earlier conflicts would apply to modern warfare." Coleman regarded Peterson with calm interest. "Lieutenant, what's your best qualification score?" Peterson straightened. 43 out of 50 at 500 yards. Top of my officer candidate class. "And in combat, how many confirmed engagements have you had beyond 300 yards? Peterson's jaw tightened. "I haven't had the opportunity to deploy to a combat zone yet, Master Sergeant." Coleman nodded, not unkindly. "Then perhaps we can learn from each other. You can teach me about your modern techniques, and I can share what worked when people were actually shooting back." The tension was palpable. Two philosophies of warfare stood in opposition: the technology-driven approach of the new generation versus the skills honed by fire methodology of the old. Colonel Wilson sensed the potential conflict. "Gentlemen, this isn't an either-or proposition. Lieutenant Peterson, your expertise with modern systems is valuable. Master Sergeant Coleman brings equally valuable experience from actual combat situations. I expect you both to work together to give these Marines every possible advantage." Peterson nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." Reynolds watched the exchange with fascination. He had trained under Peterson for months and respected the officer's knowledge of ballistics and modern shooting techniques. But something about Coleman's approach resonated at a deeper level. It felt more human. As the training session continued, Peterson stood back, arms crossed, observing with critical eyes. When Marines successfully applied Coleman's techniques, their shots finding center mass with increasing consistency, the lieutenant's expression darkened. Coleman noticed the friction but didn't acknowledge it directly. Instead, he called Reynolds forward. "Private Reynolds, you seemed particularly interested in learning. Come demonstrate for your fellow Marines." Reynolds moved to the firing position with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had been watching intently, absorbing Coleman's instructions, but performing under the veteran's direct observation was intimidating. "Forget everything else," Coleman told him quietly. "See your breath, feel your heartbeat, become aware of the wind on your skin. The rifle is just an extension of your will." Reynolds settled into position, focusing on his breathing as Coleman had taught. The world narrowed to the front sight post, the target downrange, and the gentle pressure of his finger on the trigger. Crack! The rifle discharged, and Reynolds felt rather than saw the round strike center mass on the target 400 yards away. There was something different about this shot, something more connected than any he'd fired before. "Again," Coleman instructed. 5 more rounds, 5 more hits, each one feeling more natural than the last. When Reynolds finally stood there was a new awareness in his eyes, as if he'd glimpsed something profound that had always been just beyond his perception. That, Coleman announced to the group, is what happens when you stop operating a machine and start expressing your will through it. Even Lieutenant Peterson couldn't deny the results. Reynolds had just shot the tightest group of his career without using any of the advanced technology the lieutenant had been advocating. As the training day ended, Colonel Wilson gathered everyone for a final announcement. His face was serious, his posture rigid with military formality. "I've received new orders from command," he announced. "Delta Company is being deployed to Afghanistan in 30 days. A ripple of excitement and tension passed through the assembled Marines. For many, including Reynolds, this would be their first combat deployment. The enemy we face doesn't fight with advanced technology, Wilson continued. They fight with determination, knowledge of the terrain, and skills passed down through generations of conflict. We need every advantage, both technological and fundamental. He turned to Coleman and Peterson. Gentlemen, you have 30 days to prepare these Marines for combat. I don't care about your methodological differences. I care about bringing every one of these men home alive. Is that understood? Yes, sir, they responded in unison. As the group dispersed, Reynolds approached Coleman. The questions that had been building since their first encounter couldn't be contained any longer. Master Sergeant, you mentioned Operation Desert Storm. Were you part of something called MACV SOG? Coleman's eyes narrowed slightly. Where did you hear that designation, Private? My father, Reynolds replied. He was in the Army during that time. He doesn't talk much about it, but sometimes when he's had a few drinks, he mentions MACV SOG and some mission called Red Dawn. Coleman's expression transformed a complex mixture of surprise, caution, and something deeper passing across his weathered features. What's your father's name, son? Michael Reynolds. He was a sergeant with the 10th Mountain Division. Coleman stared at Reynolds for a long moment as if seeing him for the first time. Your father, he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. Your father was a brave man. We crossed paths briefly in '91. That's all I can say about that. Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. The old veteran knew something about his father's service, something that had never been shared with him. Is there more you could tell me? Dad never talks about his time overseas. Coleman placed a hand on Reynolds' shoulder. Some stories aren't mine to tell, son. But I will say this, if you're anything like your father, you'll do just fine in Afghanistan. As Coleman walked away, Reynolds stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing with questions. The connection between this aging warrior and his own father added another dimension to what was already becoming the most significant experience of his young military career. Meanwhile, across the range, Lieutenant Peterson was engaged in an intense conversation with Colonel Wilson. Sir, with all due respect, we're sending these Marines into a 21st century conflict. They need 21st century training, not lessons from the Vietnam era. Wilson regarded Peterson coolly. Lieutenant, what Coleman is teaching these men isn't tied to any specific era. It's about the human element of combat, which remains constant, regardless of the technology involved. But the data clearly shows, the data, sire, Wilson interrupted, can't measure the will to survive, the instinct that tells you when to take a shot, or the judgment that prevents a strategic mistake. Coleman has 47 confirmed kills in combat conditions. How many do you have, Lieutenant? Peterson fell silent. I'm not dismissing your expertise, Wilson continued in a more conciliatory tone. Your knowledge of modern systems is valuable, but there's something these Marines need that can't be quantified in your data sets. Coleman has it. Find a way to work with him, not against him. As the sun began to set over Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows across the range, three men contemplated the challenge ahead from very different perspectives. Master Sergeant James Coleman, his body feeling the weight of his years, but his mind sharp with purpose, saw an opportunity to ensure his hard-won knowledge wouldn't die with him. Lieutenant Scott Peterson, his belief in technological superiority challenged, for the first time struggled to reconcile his training with the undeniable results he'd witnessed. And Private Jack Reynolds, standing at the threshold of his first combat deployment, sensed that he was part of something historic, a bridge between generations of warriors connected by skills and experiences that transcended time and technology. The ancient rifle and the old man who wielded it had changed everything. What had begun as an object of mockery had become a symbol of something timeless and essential. The journey from disrespect to understanding had only just begun, but already its impact was undeniable. For Delta Company, the real test lay ahead in the mountains of Afghanistan. But for now, the lesson of the day echoed in their minds. Sometimes the oldest tools in the hands of those who truly know how to use them can outperform any modern technology. And sometimes the greatest teachers are those who look the least like what you expect a hero to be. 3 days later, Delta Company assembled at the range again. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Word had spread throughout the base about the old Green Beret who had outshot an entire company of Marines with a World War II rifle. What had started as an object of mockery had become a legend overnight. When Coleman arrived, he wasn't alone. Colonel Wilson accompanied him along with several other senior officers. This was no longer an informal shooting session. It had the hallmarks of an official military program. Marines Colonel Wilson addressed the assembled company. Today marks the beginning of the Warrior Legacy program. Master Sergeant Coleman has agreed to serve as our first instructor in this initiative aimed at preserving the institutional knowledge and combat skills developed through decades of real-world experience. The Marines straightened to attention. This was unexpected but intriguing. I want to be clear, Wilson continued. This isn't about rejecting modern technology or training methods. It's about supplementing them with fundamental skills that have proven effective across generations of combat. Skills that don't rely on batteries or electronics. Skills that might save your lives when technology fails. Coleman stepped forward, his weathered M1 Garand cradled in his arms like an old friend. First lesson, he announced, his voice stronger and more commanding than it had been during his first visit. A rifle is not a weapon until it's in the hands of a warrior. In the hands of anyone else, it's just a machine that makes noise. Reynolds found himself nodding in agreement. 3 days ago, he would have scoffed at such a statement. Now he understood the profound truth behind it. Today we're going back to basics, Coleman continued. No optics, no laser sights, iron sights only. I want you to feel your weapons, not just operate them. Several Marines exchanged glances. This was a radical departure from their normal training regime. Staff Sergeant Reeves will demonstrate, Coleman said, gesturing for Reeves to step forward. Reeves approached carrying a standard-issue M4 carbine that had been stripped of all its accessories. No optic, no vertical grip, no tactical light. Just the basic rifle with iron sights. The fundamentals never change, Coleman explained, as Reeves assumed a prone position. Breathing, relaxation, sight alignment, trigger control. These principles have remained constant from muskets to machine guns. For the next hour, Coleman walked the Marines through breathing exercises and body positioning techniques that few of them had ever encountered in their formal training. He explained the relationship between heart rate and accuracy, demonstrating how controlled breathing could steady both the body and the mind. Reynolds absorbed every word, every demonstration with intense concentration. This was unlike any marksmanship instruction he'd ever received. Coleman wasn't just teaching them how to shoot. He was teaching them how to become one with their weapons. The human element is what separates a shooter from a marksman, Coleman explained. Any computer can calculate bullet drop and wind drift. Only a human can adapt to the 1,000 variables that exist outside the mathematical models. As the session progressed, a figure appeared at the edge of the range. A tall, stern-looking officer with the rank of lieutenant and the bearing of someone who believed firmly in his own importance. His name tape read Peterson. Lieutenant Scott Peterson watched the proceedings with growing displeasure. As the company's designated marksmanship instructor, he had developed a training program based entirely on modern techniques and technology. What he was witnessing appeared to be a step backward in his eyes. "Colonel Wilson," Peterson called out as he approached. "What exactly is going on here? These Marines are scheduled for advanced optics training this afternoon." Wilson turned to face the newcomer. "Lieutenant Peterson, perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Master Sergeant James Coleman, our new advisory instructor for the Warrior Legacy program." Peterson's expression made it clear he was not impressed. "With all due respect, sir, we have a standardized training curriculum that has been developed based on combat data from Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not sure how techniques from earlier conflicts would apply to modern warfare." Coleman regarded Peterson with calm interest. "Lieutenant, what's your best qualification score?" Peterson straightened. 43 out of 50 at 500 yards. Top of my officer candidate class. "And in combat, how many confirmed engagements have you had beyond 300 yards? Peterson's jaw tightened. "I haven't had the opportunity to deploy to a combat zone yet, Master Sergeant." Coleman nodded, not unkindly. "Then perhaps we can learn from each other. You can teach me about your modern techniques, and I can share what worked when people were actually shooting back." The tension was palpable. Two philosophies of warfare stood in opposition: the technology-driven approach of the new generation versus the skills honed by fire methodology of the old. Colonel Wilson sensed the potential conflict. "Gentlemen, this isn't an either-or proposition. Lieutenant Peterson, your expertise with modern systems is valuable. Master Sergeant Coleman brings equally valuable experience from actual combat situations. I expect you both to work together to give these Marines every possible advantage." Peterson nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." Reynolds watched the exchange with fascination. He had trained under Peterson for months and respected the officer's knowledge of ballistics and modern shooting techniques. But something about Coleman's approach resonated at a deeper level. It felt more human. As the training session continued, Peterson stood back, arms crossed, observing with critical eyes. When Marines successfully applied Coleman's techniques, their shots finding center mass with increasing consistency, the lieutenant's expression darkened. Coleman noticed the friction, but didn't acknowledge it directly. Instead, he called Reynolds forward. "Private Reynolds, you seemed particularly interested in learning. Come demonstrate for your fellow Marines." Reynolds moved to the firing position with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had been watching intently, absorbing Coleman's instructions, but performing under the veteran's direct observation was intimidating. "Forget everything else," Coleman told him quietly. "See your breath, feel your heartbeat, become aware of the wind on your skin. The rifle is just an extension of your will." Reynolds settled into position, focusing on his breathing as Coleman had taught. The world narrowed to the front sight post, the target downrange, and the gentle pressure of his finger on the trigger. Crack, the rifle discharged, and Reynolds felt rather than saw the round strike center mass on the target 400 yards away. There was something different about this shot, something more connected than any he'd fired before. "Again," Coleman instructed. 5 more rounds, 5 more hits, each one feeling more natural than the last. When Reynolds finally stood, there was a new awareness in his eyes, as if he'd glimpsed something profound that had always been just beyond his perception. "That," Coleman announced to the group, "is what happens when you stop operating a machine and start expressing your will through it." Even Lieutenant Peterson couldn't deny the results. Reynolds had just shot the tightest group of his career without using any of the advanced technology the lieutenant had been advocating. As the training day ended, Colonel Wilson gathered everyone for a final announcement. His face was serious, his posture rigid with military formality. "I've received new orders from command," he announced. "Delta Company is being deployed to Afghanistan in 30 days. A ripple of excitement and tension passed through the assembled Marines. For many, including Reynolds, this would be their first combat deployment. "The enemy we face doesn't fight with advanced technology," Wilson continued. "They fight with determination, knowledge of the terrain, and skills passed down through generations of conflict. We need every advantage, both technological and fundamental." He turned to Coleman and Peterson. "Gentlemen, you have 30 days to prepare these Marines for combat. I don't care about your methodological differences. I care about bringing every one of these men home alive. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," they responded in unison. As the group dispersed, Reynolds approached Coleman. The questions that had been building since their first encounter couldn't be contained any longer. "Master Sergeant, you mentioned Operation Desert Storm. Were you part of something called MACVSOG?" Coleman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did you hear that designation, Private?" "My father," Reynolds replied. "He was in the Army during that time. He doesn't talk much about it, but sometimes when he's had a few drinks, he mentions MACVSOG and some mission called Red Dawn." Coleman's expression transformed, a complex mixture of surprise, caution, and something deeper passing across his weathered features. "What's your father's name, son?" "Michael Reynolds. He was a sergeant with the 10th Mountain Division." Coleman stared at Reynolds for a long moment as if seeing him for the first time. "Your father," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father was a brave man. We crossed paths briefly in '91. That's all I can say about that." Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. The old veteran knew something about his father's service, something that had never been shared with him. "Is there more you could tell me? Dad never talks about his time overseas." Coleman placed a hand on Reynolds' shoulder. "Some stories aren't mine to tell, son. But I will say this, if you're anything like your father, you'll do just fine in Afghanistan." As Coleman walked away, Reynolds stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing with questions. The connection between this aging warrior and his own father added another dimension to what was already becoming the most significant experience of his young military career. Meanwhile, across the range, Lieutenant Peterson was engaged in an intense conversation with Colonel Wilson. "Sir, with all due respect, we're sending these Marines into a 21st century conflict. They need 21st century training, not lessons from the Vietnam era." Wilson regarded Peterson coolly. "Lieutenant, what Coleman is teaching these men isn't tied to any specific era. It's about the human element of combat, which remains constant regardless of the technology involved. But the data clearly shows the data mind, Wilson interrupted, can't measure the will to survive, the instinct that tells you when to take a shot, or the judgment that prevents a strategic mistake. Coleman has 47 confirmed kills in combat conditions. How many do you have, Lieutenant? Peterson fell silent. I'm not dismissing your expertise, Wilson continued in a more conciliatory tone. Your knowledge of modern systems is valuable, but there's something these Marines need that can't be quantified in your data sets. Coleman has it. Find a way to work with him, not against him. The next morning, Coleman arrived at the classroom where Delta Company had assembled. The tension in the air was palpable. Peterson stood at the front of the room, his laptop connected to a projector displaying complex ballistic calculations. Master Sergeant, Peterson greeted Coleman with forced politeness. I was just explaining to the men how modern ballistic software can calculate for environmental variables. Coleman nodded, setting his worn leather briefcase on the table. Excellent. Technology is a powerful tool when it works. He opened the case and removed a tattered notebook. But what happens when it doesn't? Peterson's smile tightened. Our equipment is highly reliable, Master Sergeant. So was ours, Coleman replied evenly. Until an Iraqi sandstorm coated everything in fine grit and turned our million-dollar systems into expensive paperweights. The Marines exchanged glances. This was the kind of first-hand experience that couldn't be found in any training manual. Coleman walked to the board and picked up a piece of chalk. Lieutenant Peterson is absolutely right about the value of your advanced systems. Learn them, master them, but also learn what to do when they fail. He began to sketch a simple diagram on the board showing the relationship between wind distance and bullet drop. In 1991, I was part of a classified operation deep inside Iraqi territory. Coleman said, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. Our mission was to gather intelligence on Republican Guard movements near the Kuwaiti border. The Marines leaned forward, captivated. This wasn't the usual dry instruction they were accustomed to. We inserted at night, established an observation post in the foothills overlooking a major supply route. Everything went according to plan for the first 36 hours. We collected valuable intel, transmitted it back to command without detection. Coleman continued sketching on the board, adding details to his diagram. Then the weather changed. A massive sandstorm rolled in, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters and completely disrupting our communications equipment. Reynolds watched Coleman's hands as they moved across the board with precision, noticing for the first time the small scars that crisscrossed the veteran's knuckles, testament to a lifetime of hard use. We were 8 men, 30 kilometers behind enemy lines with no way to call for extraction, Coleman continued, and then our position was compromised. The classroom was silent now, every Marine hanging on Coleman's words. An Iraqi patrol stumbled upon our location. We had no choice but to eliminate the threat and move immediately. But one of them got off a radio call before we could stop him. Within hours, we had mechanized infantry units converging on our position. Coleman turned from the board to face the Marines. Our primary exfiltration route was cut off. Our backup was too exposed. We had to find another way out fast. What did you do? Reynolds asked, unable to contain himself. Coleman's eyes seemed to look beyond the classroom walls, seeing again that distant desert landscape. We moved to high ground, established a defensive position overlooking the only viable approach route. There were 8 of us against what intelligence suggested was a company strength force. We needed to buy time for extraction, which meant holding that position until help could arrive. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Despite himself, he was being drawn into Coleman's narrative. That's when I saw him, Coleman continued, an Iraqi sniper setting up position about 800 yards out. If he got established, he'd be able to pin us down while the main force maneuvered into position. I had one chance to eliminate that threat. Coleman pointed to his diagram on the board. No rangefinder, no ballistic computer, just my M24 sniper rifle, iron sights, and 20 years of experience. The wind was gusting to 15 miles per hour, kicking up sand that reduced visibility to almost nothing. He traced a finger along the trajectory line he'd drawn. I had to calculate the windage and elevation in my head, factoring in temperature, humidity, and the fact that we were at a higher elevation than our training data accounted for. The Marines were absolutely still, visualizing the scene Coleman was describing. One shot, Coleman said softly. One chance to save my team. I controlled my breathing exactly as I showed you yesterday. I felt my heartbeat became aware of the wind on my skin. I squeezed the trigger between heartbeats just as the wind momentarily died down. He made a small mark on the board at the end of the trajectory line. The round traveled for just over a second before striking the target's center mass. The Iraqi sniper never got off a single shot. That one kill gave us the time we needed to hold our position until extraction arrived. Every man on my team came home alive. Coleman set down the chalk and turned to face the Marines fully. Technology is an advantage, gentlemen, but it is not a replacement for skill. Learn to use both. Even Peterson seemed affected by the story. The clinical diagrams on his laptop screen suddenly seemed sterile and theoretical compared to Coleman's first-hand account. Master Sergeant, Peterson said, his tone notably more respectful. Would you mind sharing more specifics about that shot? The technical aspects, I mean. Coleman nodded, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. I'd be happy to, Lieutenant. Perhaps we could combine our approaches. Show these Marines how your software would calculate such a shot, and then I can explain the field expedient methods we used when such technology wasn't available. For the next 2 hours, the two instructors worked together, Peterson demonstrating the precision of modern ballistic software, while Coleman shared the practical wisdom that could never be fully captured by algorithms. The Marines witnessed something rare, a bridge forming between two generations of warriors, each with valuable knowledge to impart. At the end of the session, Coleman retrieved a battered leather case from his briefcase. There's something else you all should see. He opened the case to reveal an old leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age and stained with what might have been coffee blood or both. This is my combat journal, Coleman explained. Every mission, every shot, every lesson learned the hard way. Things you won't find in any official manual. He carefully opened the book to a dog-eared page. These are the notes I made after that mission in Iraq. The calculations, the observations, the after-action assessment. Reynolds peered at the meticulous handwriting, noticing how it differed from the printed data on Peterson's slides. There was a human quality to it, small variations in pressure and style that suggested the emotional state of the writer at the time. Why isn't this information in our training manuals? Reynolds asked. Coleman closed the journal carefully. Because some knowledge can't be standardized. It's too personal, too situational. That's why the Warrior Legacy program matters. It's about passing on not just what worked, but why it worked and how to adapt those principles to new situations. As the class dispersed for lunch, Reynolds remained behind his mind, still processing the morning's revelations. Something on your mind, Private Coleman asked. You knew my father, Reynolds said simply. You said you crossed paths in '91. Was it during that mission you just described? Coleman's expression became guarded. I can't discuss the specifics of classified operations, son. It's just, my dad's never been the same since he got back from Iraq, Reynolds persisted. Whatever happened over there changed him. He has nightmares. Sometimes he drinks too much, but he never talks about it. Coleman's weathered face softened with understanding. Combat leaves marks on a man, Reynolds. Some visible, some not. Your father served his country with honor. That's what matters. But what happened to him? What changed him? Coleman considered his response carefully. Your father was part of a joint task force that intercepted some sensitive information that saved a lot of American lives. But the mission went sideways. He saw things, did things that weigh heavy on a man's soul. Reynolds absorbed this, trying to reconcile the broken man he knew with the soldier Coleman was describing. Why won't he talk about it, even to his own family? Some men can't find the words, Coleman replied gently. Or they're afraid of what those words might reveal about themselves. Or maybe they're trying to protect the people they love from carrying the same burdens they do. Reynolds nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Did you ever feel that way? Unable to talk about what you'd seen? For many years, Coleman admitted, it took me a long time to realize that carrying those stories alone was destroying me from the inside out. That's part of why I'm here now, sharing what I know. It's not just about training the next generation. It's about finding peace with my own past. Before Reynolds could respond, Lieutenant Peterson approached, his demeanor noticeably changed from earlier. Master Sergeant, I've been reviewing some of the training protocols for our Afghanistan deployment. There are scenarios we haven't adequately prepared for. I was wondering if you might have insights based on your experience. Coleman nodded, recognizing the gesture of professional respect. I'd be happy to review them with you, Lieutenant. As Peterson and Coleman walked away deep in discussion, Reynolds remained seated contemplating this new understanding of both his father and the aging warrior who was changing how he viewed his chosen profession. The next 2 weeks saw a transformation in Delta Company. Under the combined guidance of Coleman and Peterson, who had reached an uneasy but productive alliance, the Marines developed a hybrid approach to marksmanship that incorporated both cutting-edge technology and timeless fundamentals. They trained with their advanced optical systems, learning to use the ballistic computers and rangefinders to maximum effect. But they also trained without them, developing the ability to estimate range by eye, calculate windage mentally, and maintain accuracy under adverse conditions. Reynolds thrived under this dual approach. His natural aptitude for shooting, combined with an eagerness to absorb Coleman's wisdom, made him stand out even among his improving peers. He spent extra hours at the range, often staying late, to practice the breathing techniques and mental focusing exercises Coleman had taught. One evening, as twilight settled over Camp Pendleton, Reynolds was cleaning his rifle when Coleman approached carrying a small wooden box. Your shooting has improved dramatically, Coleman observed, setting the box on the table beside Reynolds. Thank you, Master Sergeant. It's starting to feel different, like the rifle's becoming part of me. Coleman nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. The best shooters don't fire weapons. They express intention through them. He gestured to the wooden box. I brought you something. Reynolds set aside his cleaning tools and looked at the box curiously. It was hand-carved from dark wood with intricate patterns etched into its surface. Go ahead, open it, Coleman encouraged. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a tarnished silver coin. Reynolds lifted it carefully, noting the weight and the worn edges that spoke of years of handling. What is it? He asked. A challenge coin, Coleman explained, from my unit in Special Forces. It was given to me by my first combat instructor, a Korean War veteran who taught me everything I know about staying alive in hostile territory. Reynolds turned the coin over in his hand, feeling the weight of history it carried. I don't understand, he said. Why are you showing me this? Coleman's eyes held a distant look. There's a tradition in special operations. When you find someone worthy of the knowledge, you carry someone who'll use it honorably. You pass on something of value. Not just skills or information, but a physical token of the bond. Reynolds' eyes widened as he realized the implication. Master Sergeant, I can't accept this. It's too important to you. Coleman shook his head. That's not how the tradition works, son. The value isn't in keeping it. It's in passing it on when the time is right. My instructor gave it to me after my first combat operation. Now I'm giving it to you before yours. Reynolds stared at the coin, feeling both honored and burdened by what it represented. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Coleman replied. Just remember what that coin represents. It's not just about shooting straight. It's about making the right decisions under pressure. It's about bringing your people home. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Peterson, his face uncharacteristically grim. Master Sergeant Coleman, Private Reynolds. He acknowledged them with a nod. There's been a change of plans. Command has moved up our deployment. We ship out in 10 days, not 30. Reynolds felt a surge of anxiety. 10 days seemed impossibly soon to prepare for combat. What changed? Coleman asked, his voice steady. Intelligence suggests increased enemy activity in our assigned sector, Peterson explained. They want us on the ground sooner than planned. Colonel Wilson has called a briefing for 0700 tomorrow. After Peterson departed, Reynolds turned to Coleman, unable to hide his concern. Are we ready? 10 days isn't much time. Coleman studied the young Marine thoughtfully. No one is ever truly ready for their first combat deployment, Reynolds. But you're better prepared than most. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember what I've taught you. He gestured to the challenge coin still in Reynolds' hand. Keep that with you. When things get chaotic, when fear starts to cloud your judgment, hold it and remember you're part of a lineage now. A tradition of warriors who face the same fears and overcome them. Reynolds carefully placed the coin back in its box. I won't let you down, Master Sergeant. I know you won't, son, Coleman replied with quiet confidence. I saw that in you from the beginning. The following days passed in a blur of accelerated preparation. Equipment was checked and double-checked, final qualifications completed, medical screenings conducted. Through it all, Coleman continued to work with the Marines, focusing particularly on scenarios they might encounter in Afghanistan's mountainous terrain. 5 days before deployment, Colonel Wilson called for a final evaluation exercise. Delta Company would demonstrate their readiness in a complex live-fire scenario designed to simulate combat conditions they might face overseas. "This is it," Wilson announced to the assembled Marines and officers. "Your final test before deployment. The course incorporates elements of both urban and rural combat environments. You'll be evaluated on accuracy, decision-making, and adaptability." He turned to Peterson and Coleman. "Lieutenant Master Sergeant, your training methods will be put to the test today. Let's see how your Marines perform." The evaluation course was brutal by design. It began with a 2-mile run in full combat gear, followed by a series of shooting stations that required rapid target acquisition and precise fire under increasingly difficult conditions. Smoke noise and artificial obstacles created the sensory overload of battle. Reynolds moved through the course with focused intensity, applying everything he'd learned. When faced with long-range targets, he employed the ballistic calculations Peterson had taught. When confronted with sudden close-quarter challenges, he relied on Coleman's lessons about instinctive shooting. As he approached the final station, fatigue began to take its toll. His arms trembled slightly as he took position behind a low barricade. The scenario called for engaging multiple targets at varying distances while maintaining awareness of potential civilian presence. Reynolds scanned the field, identifying his targets and plotting his engagement sequence. As he prepared to fire, he felt the weight of the challenge coin in his pocket. He took a deep breath, controlling his racing heart as Coleman had taught him. The targets appeared in rapid succession, some legitimate threats, others civilian decoys. Reynolds engaged each valid target with precision, his shots finding center mass despite his exhaustion and the complex variables of wind and distance. When the final target fell, a buzzer sounded, signaling the end of the evaluation. Reynolds stood, muscles burning from exertion, and saved his weapon. Only then did he notice the crowd that had gathered to observe. Colonel Wilson, Peterson, and Coleman stood together, watching the Marines complete the course. Wilson's expression was unreadable, but both instructors showed signs of tension as they awaited the results. Finally, all Marines had completed the course. The range officers compiled the scores and presented them to Wilson, who reviewed them carefully before addressing the company. "Delta Company," he began, his voice carrying across the range. "I've seen a lot of pre-deployment evaluations in my career. What I witnessed today was exceptional." A ripple of relief passed through the ranks. "Your overall performance marks the highest combined score this course has seen in 5 years." Wilson continued. "Particularly notable was your adaptability in switching between different engagement types and distances, a direct result, I believe, of the combined training approach implemented by Lieutenant Peterson and Master Sergeant Coleman." Wilson turned to the two instructors. "Gentlemen, your unorthodox partnership has produced remarkable results. Whatever personal or philosophical differences you may have, I encourage you to maintain this collaborative approach." Peterson nodded stiffly, but there was unmistakable pride in his bearing. "Thank you, sir. The combination of modern technology and traditional skills has proven effective." Coleman remained characteristically modest. "The credit belongs to the Marines, sir. We merely provided tools. They did the real work." After the formal dismissal, the Marines dispersed to clean their weapons and prepare for the final days before deployment. Reynolds was securing his gear when Peterson approached, his manner unusually hesitant. "Private Reynolds," Peterson said, "a word if you don't mind." Reynolds snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." "At ease," Peterson said. "I wanted to commend you personally on your performance today. Your scores were the highest in the company." "Thank you, sir." Peterson seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say next. "I'll admit I was skeptical about Coleman's methods. They seemed outdated, incompatible with modern warfare." He glanced across the range to where Coleman was instructing another Marine. "I was wrong. There's value in his approach that I didn't appreciate. The way you integrated both styles of shooting today was exactly what we need in Afghanistan." Reynolds was surprised by the admission. "Thank you, sir. Both you and Master Sergeant Coleman have taught me a lot." Peterson nodded. "Keep working with him. Learn everything you can. And when we deploy, I want you to consider training as a designated marksman. Your skills are too valuable to waste on standard rifleman duties." As Peterson walked away, Reynolds felt a surge of pride. Designated marksman was a specialized role that carried both prestige and responsibility. It would mean operating often as a solo shooter, engaging targets beyond the range of standard rifle fire, but below the threshold where a dedicated sniper team would be deployed. Later that evening, Reynolds sought out Coleman to share the news. He found the veteran sitting alone on a bench overlooking the ocean, his weathered M1 Garand disassembled on a cloth beside him as he methodically cleaned each component. "Master Sergeant," Reynolds greeted him. "Lieutenant Peterson recommended me for designated marksman training." Coleman looked up, a hint of a smile crossing his face. "Did he now? That's quite an endorsement coming from him. He said my shooting style, combining both your teachings, was exactly what we need overseas." Coleman reassembled the bolt of his rifle with practiced movements. The lieutenant's learning. Sometimes the old ways and the new need to work together. Reynolds sat beside Coleman, watching the precise economical motions of his hands as they worked on the rifle. "Can I ask you something personal, Master Sergeant?" "You can ask, I might not answer." "The mission in Iraq, the one you told us about, was my father there? Was he one of your team?" Coleman's hands stilled momentarily before continuing their work. "Why are you so fixated on this, Reynolds?" "Because I need to understand him," Reynolds replied earnestly. "All my life he's been this shadow, present but not really there, drinking too much, waking up screaming some nights. I thought if I knew what happened to him, maybe I could help somehow." Coleman sighed, setting down the rifle components. "Your father wasn't on my team, Reynolds, but our paths crossed during that operation. What I told you before was true. He was part of a joint task force that intercepted critical intelligence, intelligence that my team was sent to act on." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "The mission was classified then, and much of it still is. But I can tell you this, your father saved lives that day. American lives, including mine." Reynolds stared at Coleman, trying to process this revelation. "He saved your life, how?" Coleman reached for his weathered journal and opened it to a page marked with faded red tab. "This is my account of Operation Red Dawn, the parts that aren't redacted in the official record." He pointed to a hastily sketched map of what appeared to be a mountainous region with various annotations. "Your father was part of a signals intelligence unit that intercepted communications about a planned ambush. He personally delivered that intelligence to our forward operating base, traveling through 30 kilometers of hostile territory to do it." Coleman turned the page to reveal more notes and a crude drawing of what looked like a military compound. "Because of that intelligence, we changed our approach vector and avoided the ambush. Without your father's actions, my entire team would have been lost." Reynolds struggled to reconcile this image of heroism with the broken man he knew as his father. If he did something so brave, why does he seem so damaged by it? Coleman closed the journal slowly. "The intelligence your father delivered came at a cost. His unit was compromised. He was the only survivor." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the air between them. "He blames himself," Reynolds realized aloud, "for the others not making it out." Coleman nodded. "Survivor's guilt is a terrible burden. I've carried my share of it. So is every combat veteran who's lost friends while they themselves lived. Is that why you're doing this, training us to make peace with your own past?" Coleman considered the question thoughtfully. "Partly, but it's more than that. It's about making sure the lessons we learn, sometimes at terrible cost, aren't lost, so the next generation of warriors doesn't have to pay the same price to learn them." He looked directly at Reynolds, his gaze intense. "Your father paid that price. So did I. So did countless others before us. If what I'm teaching you saves even one life in Afghanistan, then it's worth every minute." Reynolds nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And that's why you gave me the challenge coin, not just as a good luck charm, but as a reminder of that responsibility." "Exactly," Coleman confirmed. "You're not just carrying your own life into combat, Reynolds. You're carrying the legacy of everyone who came before you, everyone who sacrificed to provide the knowledge you now possess." Coleman began reassembling his Garand with swift, precise movements. "In 10 days, you'll be in Afghanistan facing real enemies with real weapons. Remember what I've taught you. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and when technology fails, as it sometimes will, trust the fundamentals." The two men sat in silence as the sun set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the base. Reynolds contemplated the strange twist of fate that had brought him under the tutelage of a man whose life had been saved by his own father, creating a circle of connection he couldn't have imagined when he first mocked the old warrior with his ancient rifle. In that moment, Reynolds understood something profound about the nature of military service. It wasn't just about the individual or even the current mission. It was about being part of an unbroken line of warriors stretching back through generations, each one learning from those who came before, each one responsible for carrying that knowledge forward. And as the last light faded from the sky, Reynolds made a silent promise to honor that legacy, to prove worthy of the trust Coleman had placed in him, and perhaps, in some small way, to redeem the sacrifices his father had made so many years ago in the deserts of Iraq. The final days before deployment passed with increasing intensity. Colonel Wilson had arranged for a series of specialized training sessions focused on the specific challenges of Afghanistan's terrain and climate. Coleman and Peterson continued their unlikely partnership, each bringing their unique expertise to prepare the Marines for what lay ahead. 4 days before departure, Wilson called Coleman and Peterson to his office. His expression was grave as they entered. "Gentlemen, I've received updated intelligence on our area of operations." Wilson began without preamble. "The situation is more volatile than initially assessed. Taliban fighters are amassing in larger numbers than expected, and they're better equipped." He spread a map across his desk, pointing to a mountainous region marked with various tactical annotations. "Our primary mission remains the same: establish a forward operating base in this valley to support ongoing operations. But resistance is likely to be significant." Peterson studied the map intently. "These ridgelines provide perfect overwatch positions for enemy snipers." "Exactly," Wilson agreed. "And recent reports indicate they've acquired a limited number of advanced optical systems, likely from captured coalition equipment." Coleman leaned closer, his finger tracing the contours of the terrain. "Reminds me of the Hindu Kush back in the early days of Afghanistan. Perfect terrain for harassment tactics. They'll engage from distance, then melt away before you can return effective fire." "That's precisely my concern," Wilson said. "We're facing an enemy that combines modern equipment with generations-old knowledge of the terrain. I need Delta Company prepared for both aspects of this threat." He fixed both instructors with a serious gaze. "Can your Marines handle this?" Peterson straightened. "Absolutely, sir. Their proficiency with our weapon systems is exceptional. And their fundamental skills have improved dramatically," Coleman added. "They're learning to shoot without relying solely on technology." Wilson nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good, because this deployment will test every aspect of their training." He hesitated before continuing. "There's one more thing. I've authorized the formation of a special designated marksman squad drawing from our best shooters. Lieutenant Peterson will command, but Master Sergeant Coleman will have advisory status." The announcement surprised both men. Sir Peterson began cautiously. "While I appreciate the confidence, I'm not sure mixing chain of command is wise." "This isn't about chain of command, Lieutenant," Wilson clarified. "Coleman's role is advisory only. But given the terrain and the nature of the threat, I want our marksmen to have the benefit of his experience." He turned to Coleman. "Are you willing to deploy with the company in this capacity? It would be strictly voluntary given your retired status." Coleman didn't hesitate. "If it helps bring these Marines home alive, I'm in." "Excellent," Wilson said. "The designated marksman squad will consist of 5 Marines. Lieutenant Peterson, I'll leave the selection to you, but I strongly recommend including Private Reynolds. His scores have been exceptional." Peterson nodded. "Reynolds was already at the top of my list, sir." As they left Wilson's office, Peterson turned to Coleman with newfound respect in his eyes. "I never expected to be deploying with a legend from Special Forces. The men will be encouraged by your presence." Coleman shook his head modestly. "I'm just an old soldier with a few tricks to teach. You're their leader, Lieutenant. They'll look to you when the shooting starts." Peterson considered this. "Perhaps we can continue as we've begun combining our approaches. Your experience and my technical knowledge." "I think that's exactly what these Marines need," Coleman agreed. The news of Coleman's advisory role spread quickly through Delta Company, bolstering morale. For Reynolds, the announcement came with additional significance. He was officially named to the designated marksman squad, along with 4 other Marines who had demonstrated superior shooting skills. The newly formed unit began specialized training, immediately focusing on the unique challenges of long-range engagement in mountainous terrain. Coleman shared techniques developed during his time in Special Forces, while Peterson provided detailed instruction on the advanced optics and range-finding equipment they would use in Afghanistan. 2 days before deployment, as Reynolds was zeroing his rifle's new scope under Coleman's watchful eye, a civilian vehicle pulled up to the range. Reynolds recognized the driver immediately, his father, Michael Reynolds, a man who rarely left home and almost never visited the base. The elder Reynolds walked stiffly toward them, his face an unreadable mask. At 52, he looked older than his years, his hair prematurely gray, his posture slightly stooped from some invisible weight. "Dad?" Reynolds called out in surprise, safing his weapon and standing to meet his father. "What are you doing here?" Michael Reynolds didn't answer immediately, his attention fixed on Coleman. The two old soldiers regarded each other with the instant recognition of shared experience. "Master Sergeant Coleman," Michael said, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. "It's been a long time." Coleman extended his hand. "Too long, Sergeant Reynolds. You're looking well." It was a kind lie, and everyone knew it, but Michael accepted it with a nod as he shook Coleman's hand. "Jack told us he was shipping out," Michael explained, turning to his son. "Thought I should come say goodbye in person." Reynolds was stunned. His father had never shown such interest in his military career before. In fact, he had actively discouraged Reynolds from enlisting, though he'd never explained why. "I appreciate that, Dad," Reynolds said, uncertain how to navigate this unexpected situation. Michael glanced at the rifle on the shooting bench. "Designated marksman, they tell me. That's quite an honor." "Yes, sir," Reynolds replied automatically. "Lieutenant Peterson selected me for the squad." Michael nodded, then turned back to Coleman. "Can we talk privately?" Coleman seemed to understand something Reynolds didn't. "Of course, let's take a walk." As the two older men moved out of earshot, Reynolds watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. His father rarely spoke about his military service, and never with such evident purpose. Peterson approached, noticing Reynolds' distraction. "Everything all right, Private?" "Yes, sir, just—" "My father surprised me by showing up." Peterson followed Reynolds' gaze to where Coleman and Michael were engaged in intense conversation. "Your father served Army, signals intelligence in Desert Storm. That's about all I know. He doesn't talk about it." Peterson nodded with understanding. "Many don't, especially those who saw the worst of it." Across the range, the conversation between Coleman and Michael grew animated, Michael gesturing forcefully while Coleman listened with grave attention. Finally, Coleman placed a hand on Michael's shoulder in what appeared to be a reassuring gesture, and they began walking back toward Reynolds. As they approached, Reynolds could see his father's face had transformed. The perpetual tension he carried seemed somehow diminished, replaced by a complexity of emotion that Reynolds couldn't fully interpret. "Jack," Michael said, his voice steadier than before. "Master Sergeant Coleman tells me you've become quite the marksman." "I've been learning from the best, sir," Reynolds replied, nodding toward Coleman. Michael took a deep breath. "I owe you an explanation, son, about why I never wanted you to enlist, about why I've been the way I've been." Reynolds felt his heart rate quicken. After years of silence, his father was finally willing to talk about his past. "You don't have to, Dad, not if it's difficult." "I do," Michael insisted. "Before you ship out, you need to understand." He glanced at Coleman. "James has convinced me of that much." Coleman nodded encouragingly. "Tell him what you told me, Michael. He deserves to know." Michael squared his shoulders as if preparing to lift a heavy burden. "In '91, during the Gulf War, I was part of a signals intelligence unit. We intercepted communications about a planned ambush of a special forces team operating deep in Iraqi territory." Reynolds listened intently, hearing for the first time the story Coleman had alluded to. "The information was time-sensitive. Our communications were compromised. Someone had to deliver the intelligence in person." Michael's voice grew distant. "I volunteered." "You crossed 30 kilometers of hostile territory," Coleman interjected, "alone, to warn us." Michael nodded, his eyes focused on some point in the distant past. "The mission was successful. The intelligence was delivered. The Special Forces team avoided the ambush and completed their objective." He paused, his expression darkening. "But while I was gone, my unit was attacked. Everyone was killed. 7 good men, some with families waiting for them back home." Reynolds felt a chill as the pieces finally connected. "You survived because you volunteered for the mission." "Yes," Michael confirmed, the word heavy, with decades of guilt. "I lived while they died, and every day since I've asked myself if I made the right choice. If I could have somehow saved them if I'd been there. You couldn't have, Coleman said firmly. The attack was overwhelming. If you'd stayed, you'd have died with them, and my team would have walked into an ambush that none of us would have survived. He turned to Reynolds. Your father's actions saved 12 Special Forces operators that day, including me. Reynolds struggled to process this revelation. Why didn't you ever tell me, Dad? Michael's eyes finally met his son's. Because I was ashamed, Jack. Not of what I did, but of what it cost. And because I never wanted you to face the same impossible choices that war forces on a man. He gestured to Reynolds' rifle. But here you are anyway, about to deploy to a combat zone as a designated marksman. Making me proud and terrifying me all at once. Reynolds was speechless, seeing his father clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. I came here today, Michael continued, because Coleman contacted me, told me you were shipping out, made me realize I couldn't let you go without telling you the truth. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a tarnished medal, a bronze star with V device for valor. This was awarded for that mission. I've kept it hidden away because looking at it reminded me of what was lost, not what was saved. Michael pressed the medal into his son's hand. Take it with you to Afghanistan, not as a lucky charm, but as a reminder that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that matter most. Reynolds closed his fingers around the medal, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. I will, Dad, I promise. And one more thing, Michael added, his voice stronger now. I'm sorry for not being the father you deserved, for letting my ghost keep me from seeing the man you were becoming. The moment was interrupted by Lieutenant Peterson, who approached with reluctant purpose. Private Reynolds, I apologize for the intrusion, but we have a final briefing in 20 minutes. Reynolds nodded acknowledgement, then turned back to his father. I have to go, Dad. Michael straightened something of the soldier he once was showing through his civilian demeanor. Go do your duty, son, and come back home when it's done. As Reynolds gathered his equipment, Coleman and Michael exchanged a few final words. Two veterans from different generations connected by shared experiences that most civilians could never understand. Later, as the designated marksman squad assembled for their briefing, Reynolds felt a new sense of purpose. In his pocket rested two tokens of profound significance, Coleman's challenge coin and his father's bronze star. Together, they represented a lineage of service and sacrifice that now included him. Lieutenant Peterson began the briefing with uncharacteristic solemnity. Gentlemen, in 48 hours, we deploy to Afghanistan. The mission is challenging. The terrain is hostile. The enemy is determined. He gestured to Coleman, who stood at the back of the room. But we have been trained by the best. We have learned from those who went before us, and we will not let them down. As the briefing continued, Reynolds found his thoughts returning to his father's story and Coleman's teachings. He understood now that he was part of something larger than himself, a continuum of warriors stretching back through generations, each passing on their hard-won knowledge to those who followed. And in that moment, he made a silent vow to honor that legacy, to apply every lesson Coleman had taught him, to make his father proud, and most importantly, to bring his fellow Marines home alive from the mountains of Afghanistan. The wheel of history turned, and once more American warriors prepared to enter conflict in distant lands. But this time they carried with them not just the technology of modern warfare, but the timeless wisdom of those who had fought before them, a fusion of past and present that might just give them the edge they needed to survive. The Afghanistan sun beat down mercilessly on the forward operating base as Delta Company completed their first week of deployment. The mountainous terrain surrounding them was as beautiful as it was treacherous, with jagged peaks and deep valleys providing perfect cover for enemy fighters who knew the land intimately. Reynolds sat in the shade of a makeshift shelter, meticulously cleaning his designated marksman rifle. The M110 semi-automatic sniper system was a marvel of modern engineering, with its advanced optics, match-grade barrel, and suppressor. Yet Reynolds found himself applying the cleaning techniques Coleman had taught him, methodical, almost meditative in their precision. "How's she running?" came a familiar voice. Reynolds looked up to see Coleman approaching. Despite being in his 70s, the veteran had adapted quickly to the harsh environment. He wore standard-issue desert camouflage with a special advisor patch, though he still carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a Special Forces operator. "Smooth, Master Sergeant," Reynolds replied, "though I'm still getting used to the thermal scope. Different from what we trained with back home." Coleman nodded, taking a seat beside the young Marine. Technology changes, fundamentals don't. Remember what I taught you about reading terrain. For the past 7 days, Delta Company had been conducting reconnaissance patrols and establishing relationships with local village elders. Intelligence suggested that Taliban fighters were moving through the region in increasing numbers, though direct contact had been minimal thus far. Lieutenant Peterson wants the designated marksman squad to run drills on the eastern ridge tomorrow, Reynolds said, reassembling his rifle with practice movements. Says we need to familiarize ourselves with engaging targets from elevated positions. Good call, Coleman agreed. This terrain changes the equations. Wind behaves differently in mountain passes than it does on flat ground. You'll need to adjust your calculations. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lieutenant Peterson. The officer's initial skepticism toward Coleman had evolved into grudging respect during their time in Afghanistan. The harsh realities of combat deployment had a way of eroding theoretical differences in favor of practical solutions. Master Sergeant, Peterson acknowledged Coleman with a nod. Reynolds, we've got a situation briefing in 10 minutes. Colonel Wilson wants the designated marksman squad there. The tone in Peterson's voice suggested this wasn't a routine briefing. Reynolds quickly finished reassembling his rifle and followed the two men toward the command tent. Inside, Colonel Wilson stood before a table spread with maps and satellite imagery. His face was grave as he addressed the assembled Marines. Gentlemen, we have a developing situation, Wilson began without preamble. 2 hours ago, one of our reconnaissance drones spotted a large group of fighters moving through the Korengal Valley, approximately 15 clicks northwest of our position. He pointed to a narrow passage between steep mountain walls. Intelligence estimates between 30 and 40 combatants, heavily armed, moving toward this village here. The village, labeled Najiban on the map, was a small collection of structures nestled in a valley that controlled access to several crucial supply routes. We believe they intend to establish a presence there, which would threaten our supply lines and potentially cut off 3 other villages that have been cooperating with coalition forces. Wilson looked up at the Marines, his expression somber. We need to stop them before they reach Najiban. That means intercepting them here at this choke point. He indicated a narrow pass between 2 steep ridges. Delta Company will establish blocking positions on both sides of the pass. The designated marksman squad will provide overwatch from this elevated position. Peterson studied the terrain carefully. That's difficult ground, sir. The approach to the overwatch position is exposed in several places, which is why you'll move into position tonight under cover of darkness, Wilson replied. You need to be in place before dawn. The main force will move out at 0400. Coleman had been silent until now, examining the satellite imagery with the practiced eye of someone who had planned countless similar operations. What about extraction, Colonel? If the enemy force is as large as intelligence suggests, they could attempt to flank our position once the engagement begins. Wilson nodded, appreciating the veteran's tactical insight. We'll have air support on standby and a quick reaction force positioned here ready to assist if needed. He turned to Peterson. Lieutenant, you'll command the designated marksman squad. Master Sergeant Coleman will accompany you as advisor. I want your best shooters in position to control that battle space. Every fighter you stop before they reach our blocking positions is one less threat to our Marines on the ground. Peterson straightened. Understood, sir. We'll be in position by 0300. Before dismissing them, Wilson added, Master Sergeant Coleman, a word about your role. While your experience is invaluable, I need to be clear that your status is strictly advisory. You'll maintain communication and provide tactical guidance, but you're not to engage unless absolutely necessary for self-defense. Is that understood? Perfectly clear, Colonel, Coleman replied. My job is to advise, not engage. As the briefing concluded, Reynolds felt a familiar tension building in his chest. This would be his first true combat operation, not just a patrol or a training exercise, but a deliberate engagement with an enemy force. Outside the command tent, Peterson gathered the designated marksman squad, Reynolds, and 4 other Marines who had demonstrated superior marksmanship skills. Their faces were serious as the lieutenant outlined the mission parameters. We move out at 2100 hours. Full combat load, extra ammunition. Expect to be in position for at least 24 hours. Pack accordingly. As the squad dispersed to prepare their equipment, Coleman approached Reynolds. How are you feeling about this, son? Reynolds checked his magazine pouches, ensuring each was properly secured. Ready, Master Sergeant, just like we trained. Coleman studied him with knowing eyes. It's normal to be nervous before your first real engagement. Everyone is, whether they admit it or not. Even you, Reynolds asked. A faint smile crossed Coleman's weathered face. Especially me. Before my first combat operation, I was so nervous I couldn't eat for 2 days. But here's what I learned: fear isn't your enemy. It sharpens your senses, keeps you alert. The trick is to acknowledge it, then set it aside to do your job. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into Reynolds' hand. It was another challenge coin, different from the one he'd given him back at Camp Pendleton. This one bore the insignia of the 5th Special Forces Group and appeared much older. This was given to me before my first combat mission, Coleman explained, by my team leader. He told me that as long as I carried it, I was never alone. I was part of a brotherhood that stretched back through generations of warriors. Now I'm passing it to you. Reynolds turned the coin over in his palm, feeling its weight. I can't take this, Master Sergeant. It's too important. That's exactly why you should have it, Coleman insisted. More as a lucky charm, but as a reminder of what you're fighting for. Not just your country or even your fellow Marines, but for the legacy of all those who came before you. Don't let us down. The night was moonless as the designated marksman squad moved silently through the rugged terrain toward their overwatch position. Peterson led the way, navigating by GPS and night vision, with Coleman close behind, occasionally offering quiet suggestions about route selection based on his decades of experience in similar environments. Reynolds moved carefully, his rifle secured across his chest, every sense heightened. The weight of his equipment, the sound of his own breathing, the feel of loose stones beneath his boots, everything seemed amplified in the darkness. After 3 hours of careful movement, they reached their designated position, a rocky outcropping that provided excellent fields of fire down into the pass below, while offering decent cover from potential return fire. The position was approximately 600 meters from the narrowest point of the pass, well within effective range of their rifles. Set up here, Peterson whispered, indicating natural firing positions among the rocks. Reynolds, you take the center position. Best sight lines. The Marines moved silently, establishing their positions and preparing their weapons. Coleman moved among them, checking sight lines and offering quiet advice about wind indicators and range estimation. As Reynolds settled into his position, he felt a strange calm descend over him. All the training, all the preparation had led to this moment. He mentally reviewed Coleman's teachings: control your breathing, feel your heartbeat, become one with your weapon. The rifle was merely an extension of his will. The hours passed slowly. The first hint of dawn illuminated the eastern sky, gradually revealing the dramatic landscape before them. The pass below was still shrouded in shadows, but the surrounding peaks caught the first golden rays of sunlight. Through his scope, Reynolds studied the terrain, identifying potential movement routes and range markers. According to intelligence, the enemy force would be approaching from the northwest, following a goat trail that wound through the valley before entering the pass. Movement, whispered one of the Marines to Reynolds' right. Northwest approach, approximately 1,200 meters. Reynolds adjusted his scope, scanning the indicated area. There, moving in a disciplined column along the trail, came the enemy fighters. They moved with the confidence of men who knew the terrain intimately, carrying a mixture of AK-47s, RPGs, and what appeared to be several heavy machine guns. I count 32 tangos, Peterson reported quietly into his radio. Heavily armed, moving in tactical formation. These aren't local militia. They look experienced. Copy that, came Colonel Wilson's reply. Delta Company is in position. Engage when targets enter your designated kill zone, approximately 800 meters from your position. Peterson acknowledged the order, then turned to his squad. We engage on my command. Priority targets are heavy weapons operators and apparent leaders. Reynolds, you take the point, man. He appears to be directing their movement. Reynolds located the target through his scope, a tall fighter with a distinctive red scarf who seemed to be giving instructions to the others. At the current distance, over 1,000 meters, the shot would be challenging, but not impossible with his rifle's capabilities. Wind reading, Coleman murmured, studying the terrain between their position and the approaching fighters. Light crosswind from the east, approximately 3 miles per hour at our position, but watch the vegetation in the valley. Different current down there. Reynolds noted the slight movement of brush along the valley floor, indicating a stronger wind current than what they felt at their elevated position. He made a mental adjustment to his windage calculation. The minutes crawled by as the enemy force moved steadily closer. Reynolds could feel his heart rate increasing and consciously controlled his breathing, just as Coleman had taught him. Inhale, hold, exhale partially, hold. They're entering the kill zone, Peterson announced quietly. Stand by. Reynolds centered his crosshairs on the leader's chest, applying the necessary adjustments for distance and wind. The world narrowed to his sight picture, everything else fading into the background. Engage, Peterson commanded. Reynolds squeezed the trigger smoothly between heartbeats. The rifle recoiled against his shoulder as the suppressed shot broke the morning stillness with a muted crack. Through his scope, he watched the leader crumple instantly. Before the other fighters could react, the rest of the squad opened fire, each marksman engaging their assigned targets with deadly precision. The initial volley dropped 7 fighters. The remainder scrambled for cover, their disciplined formation dissolving into chaos as they sought shelter among rocks in sparse vegetation. Good effect on targets, Peterson reported into his radio. 7 enemy KIA. Remainder are in cover pinned down between our position and Delta Company's blocking force. Copy that, Wilson responded. Maintain pressure. Don't let them retreat back up the valley. For the next 20 minutes, the designated marksman squad engaged targets of opportunity as the enemy fighters attempted to maneuver. Each time a fighter broke cover, precise fire from above forced them back or eliminated the threat entirely. Reynolds worked methodically, controlling his breathing between shots, adjusting for changing wind conditions, as Coleman quietly advised. It was surreal how similar it felt to the training exercises back at Camp Pendleton, yet profoundly different knowing these were real people in his crosshairs. Then the situation changed dramatically. RPG, shouted one of the Marines as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked toward their position from a concealed fighter they hadn't spotted. The projectile exploded against the rocks 10 meters to their right, showering them with debris. Coleman, who had been observing from that position, was thrown sideways by the blast, landing heavily against a boulder. Man down, called Martinez, crawling toward Coleman. Keep engaging, Peterson ordered. Don't let them gain momentum. Reynolds maintained his fire discipline, eliminating another fighter who tried to advance, but his mind raced with concern for Coleman. From the corner of his eye, he could see Martinez checking the older man, who was conscious but bleeding from what appeared to be shrapnel wounds to his left side. How bad? Peterson called to Martinez. Multiple fragments, sir. Bleeding but not arterial. He needs evac. Peterson keyed his radio, reporting Coleman's condition and requesting medical evacuation while continuing to direct the engagement. Reynolds felt a surge of anger and focused it into his shooting, taking down 2 more fighters who attempted to flank their position. Reynolds, came Coleman's strained voice from behind him. Don't lose your rhythm. Breathe. Focus. Even wounded, the veteran was still teaching, still guiding. The firefight intensified as the enemy, realizing one of their RPGs had found a mark, concentrated fire on the marksman team's position. Bullets pinged off rocks around them as Peterson coordinated with the main blocking force below. They're trying to suppress us while their main force withdraws up the valley, Peterson observed. We can't let that happen. He relayed the situation to Colonel Wilson. Enemy attempting to withdraw northwest, requesting permission to adjust position to maintain engagement. Negative, came Wilson's reply. Stay in place. We're sending 2nd Platoon to cut off their retreat. Continue to engage from your current position. Medevac is inbound for Master Sergeant Coleman, ETA, 15 minutes. Reynolds refocused on his optics, continuing to engage targets as they appeared. Then something caught his eye, a movement pattern that didn't match the rest of the enemy force. Through his scope, he observed 3 fighters breaking away from the main group, moving rapidly along a nearly invisible trail that skirted the eastern edge of the valley. 3 tangos breaking east, he reported. Looks like they're flanking toward the village. Peterson quickly assessed the situation. They must know another route. If they reached Najiban before us, they could set up an ambush or take hostages. He keyed his radio to report, but Coleman's voice interrupted, weak but urgent. Wait, look there. Despite his wounds, Coleman had propped himself up and was using binoculars to scan the eastern route. See that disturbance in the vegetation pattern? That's not wind, that's movement traces. More fighters have already moved that way during the main engagement. Peterson studied the area Coleman indicated, then nodded grimly. You're right. They're splitting their force. The main group is a diversion. He immediately relayed this assessment to Colonel Wilson, who responded with new orders. Lieutenant, take half your squad and intercept the flanking force. The rest will maintain pressure on the main group. Peterson looked at the remaining Marines. Reynolds, you and Martinez come with me. The rest of you stay here and continue engaging the main force. Then he turned to Coleman. Master Sergeant Medevac will be here soon. Carlson will stay with you until they arrive. Coleman nodded weakly. Go. And Reynolds, remember your training. Move carefully, shoot deliberately. With a final glance at his wounded mentor, Reynolds gathered his equipment and followed Peterson and Martinez as they began a rapid descent toward the eastern trail. The route was punishing steep rocky with loose scree that threatened to send them sliding down the mountainside with every step. Yet they moved with determined urgency, knowing what was at stake if the enemy fighters reached the village first. After 20 minutes of carefully controlled descent, they reached the valley floor and located the trail the fighters had taken. Fresh footprints confirmed Coleman's assessment. More than a dozen men had passed this way recently. We need to move faster, Peterson said, checking the GPS coordinates of the village. They've got at least a 30-minute head start. The three Marines advanced at a steady jog, their rifles at the ready. The trail wound through increasingly dense vegetation as it approached the more fertile land surrounding Najiban. The thick brush limited visibility and created numerous potential ambush points. Reynolds felt the tension building in his chest. In open terrain, the designated marksman's role was clear. Engage targets from distance, provide overwatch. But in close quarters like this, with limited sightlines, the dynamics changed dramatically. After another kilometer, Peterson raised his fist, signaling a halt. Ahead, the sound of voices carried faintly through the brush. He gestured for Reynolds and Martinez to take covering positions as he crept forward to assess the situation. When Peterson returned, his expression was grim. 12 tangos stopped about 200 meters ahead. They're preparing something looks like improvised explosives. My guess is they're planning to rig the village entrance. We're outnumbered 4-1, Martinez whispered. But we have surprise, Peterson replied. And we don't have a choice. If they set those explosives, the entire village is at risk. He outlined a simple but effective plan they would approach from 3 different angles using the dense vegetation as cover. On Peterson's signal, they would engage simultaneously, creating the impression of a larger force. Reynolds moved carefully into position, his heart pounding in his chest. This was close-quarters combat, not the long-range engagement he had trained for. Yet as he settled into his final position, he felt a strange calm descend over him, the same feeling he had experienced during Coleman's training. Breathe, focus, become one with your weapon. Through a gap in the foliage, he could see 4 fighters huddled around what appeared to be improvised explosive materials. The others were establishing a perimeter, their weapons ready, but their attention focused outward away from Reynolds' position. He waited for Peterson's signal, 3 clicks over the radio. 1 click, 2 clicks, 3. Reynolds engaged his closest targets with controlled pairs, 2 rapid shots to the center mass. 2 fighters fell immediately. Across the clearing, Peterson and Martinez opened fire simultaneously, creating a devastating crossfire. The surprise was total. 6 enemy fighters fell in the initial volley before the others could even determine where the fire was coming from. The remaining fighters returned fire blindly, their shots going wide as they sought non-existent cover. Reynolds continued engaging targets, methodically shifting position between shots to avoid return fire. The training Coleman had instilled, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to control breathing, to shoot with deliberate precision, now paid dividends. Within minutes, it was over. The last fighter fell as he attempted to flee up the trail, dropped by Martinez's well-placed shot. Clear, Peterson called out, moving carefully among the fallen fighters to ensure the threat was neutralized. Check for survivors. Reynolds approached the improvised explosives with caution. The materials were arranged around several propane tanks, a makeshift but potentially devastating device that could have caused significant casualties in the confined space of the village. Sir, he called to Peterson, you need to see this. The lieutenant examined the explosive materials, his expression hardening. This wasn't just meant to damage property. This was designed to maximize civilian casualties. He keyed his radio, reporting their situation to Colonel Wilson and requesting an EOD team to properly dispose of the explosives. Threat neutralized, sir. 12 enemy KIA. We've secured improvised explosive materials they were preparing to deploy in Najiban. Good work, Lieutenant, came Wilson's reply. The main force is also contained. We have 7 prisoners. Hold your position until the EOD team arrives. There was a pause before Wilson continued, his tone shifting. And Lieutenant, Master Sergeant Coleman's condition has worsened. The medevac is transporting him back to base for immediate surgery. Shrapnel penetrated deeper than initially assessed. Reynolds felt his stomach tighten. The elderly warrior had seemed indestructible, a force of nature. The thought that he might be seriously wounded was difficult to process. "Understood, sir," Peterson replied, his voice carefully controlled. "We'll complete our mission here and return to base as soon as possible." As they waited for the EOD team, Reynolds found himself examining the faces of the men they had killed. Most appeared to be in their 20s or 30s, with the hardened look of experienced fighters. One in particular caught his attention, younger than the others, perhaps no older than Reynolds himself. "First time seeing the aftermath up close?" Peterson asked, noting Reynolds' expression. "Yes, sir," Reynolds admitted. "Different from engaging targets through a scope at 600 meters. Peterson nodded with understanding. "This is the reality of what we do, Reynolds. Never forget that behind every target is a human being who made choices that led them here. They made their choice. We made ours." The EOD team arrived an hour later, carefully dismantling the explosive materials, while Peterson, Reynolds, and Martinez maintained security. By late afternoon, they were cleared to return to base, their mission complete. The walk back was conducted in thoughtful silence, each man processing the events of the day in his own way. For Reynolds, the experience had transformed something abstract into something viscerally real. The weight of Coleman's challenge coin seemed heavier in his pocket now, as did the responsibility it represented. When they arrived back at the forward operating base, they found the atmosphere subdued. Colonel Wilson greeted them personally, his face showing both fatigue and satisfaction. "Outstanding work, gentlemen. Intelligence indicates this was a significant enemy force, well-trained and well-equipped. Your actions today not only protected Najiban, but likely prevented attacks on several other villages in the region." Reynolds couldn't wait any longer. "Sir, how is Master Sergeant Coleman?" Wilson's expression grew serious. "He's stable but critical. The shrapnel caused more damage than initially believed. They've removed several fragments, but he's lost a significant amount of blood. The surgeons are optimistic, but given his age, the next 24 hours will be crucial." Reynolds felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Permission to visit him, sir." "Once he's out of surgery," Wilson replied. "For now, get some rest. You earned it." As Peterson debriefed the colonel on the specifics of their engagement, Reynolds made his way to the field hospital. He wasn't allowed inside the surgical area, but a sympathetic nurse promised to inform him when Coleman was moved to recovery. In the meantime, Reynolds found a quiet corner and pulled out the challenge coin Coleman had given him. He ran his thumb over the worn surface, thinking about everything the old warrior had taught him, not just about shooting, but about what it meant to be a warrior, to carry the responsibility for others' lives. 4 hours later, the nurse found him. "Your friend is out of surgery. He's still unconscious, but you can see him briefly." Coleman lay pale and still on the hospital bed, various tubes and monitors connected to his frail frame. It was jarring to see the powerful presence reduced to this vulnerable state. Reynolds stood beside the bed, uncertain what to do or say. "He's tougher than he looks," came a voice from behind him. Reynolds turned to see the surgeon removing his surgical cap. The shrapnel missed his vital organs by millimeters. If he'd been positioned just slightly differently, we'd be having a very different conversation. "Will he recover?" Reynolds asked. "Barring complications, yes," the surgeon replied. "But it will take time, and he certainly won't be returning to field operations on this deployment." The news hit Reynolds harder than expected. He'd come to rely on Coleman's guidance, his quiet wisdom in the chaos of combat. The thought of facing the remaining months without that anchor was unsettling. He looked down at Coleman's weathered face, now relaxed in unconsciousness. "Thank you for what you have taught me," he said softly. "I'll make sure it wasn't wasted." Over the next 2 weeks, Coleman's condition gradually improved. By the third day, he was conscious and alert, though frustrated by his confinement to the hospital bed. By the end of the week, he was sitting up and insisting on briefings about the company's operations. Reynolds visited daily, often bringing Lieutenant Peterson, who had begun to rely on Coleman's tactical insights even from his hospital bed. It was during one of these visits, 10 days after the incident, that Coleman dropped a surprising revelation. "I've been communicating with your father, Reynolds," he said without preamble. Reynolds stared at him in shock. "My father? How?" "Email when we have connectivity," Coleman replied. "Started right after we deployed. He wanted updates on how you were doing, but was too proud to tell you he was worried." He's never shown that much interest in my military career before, Reynolds said, still processing this information. Precisely because he knows exactly what it entails, Coleman said pointedly. He's been following your progress through me. Says he's proud of you, by the way. Reynolds sat with this information, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. His father, the distant, troubled man who had discouraged his enlistment, had been secretly keeping tabs on him through Coleman all this time. Did you tell him about... Reynolds gestured toward Coleman's bandaged torso. Not the details, Coleman admitted. Just that there was an incident and that you performed admirably. No need to worry him unnecessarily. Before Reynolds could respond, Colonel Wilson entered the room, his face grave. Gentlemen, I've received new orders from command. Based on intelligence gathered from the prisoners we captured, we're planning a major operation to clear the remaining enemy forces from the region. It launches in 48 hours. He turned to Reynolds. Given Lieutenant Peterson's assessment of your performance and Master Sergeant Coleman's recommendation, you're being appointed acting squad leader for the designated marksman team during this operation. Reynolds straightened, surprised by the sudden promotion. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. See that you don't, Wilson replied. There's a planning session at 1800 hours. Be there. After Wilson departed, Reynolds turned to Coleman, who was smiling faintly. You knew about this? I might have suggested it to Peterson, Coleman admitted. You're ready, Reynolds. You've absorbed everything I've taught you, and you've proven yourself in combat. Now it's your turn to lead to pass on what you've learned. But I still have so much more to learn from you, Reynolds protested. Coleman shook his head. That's how it always feels, son. But the truth is there comes a point where the student has to become the teacher. My job now is to help prepare you for that role before I'm shipped back to the States for recovery. For the next 48 hours, Coleman worked with Reynolds from his hospital bed, reviewing tactical scenarios and offering insights on leadership under fire. They analyzed satellite imagery, discussed contingency plans, and prepared for every foreseeable complication. On the morning of the operation, Reynolds stopped by the hospital one last time. Coleman was sitting up in bed looking stronger than he had since the injury. Remember what I told you? Coleman said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Technology is a tool, not a crutch. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and when in doubt, remember the fundamentals. Reynolds nodded, the lesson ingrained now. I will, Master Sergeant. One more thing, Coleman added, his expression serious. Leadership isn't about being the best shot or giving the most orders. It's about bringing your people home. All of them. I understand, Reynolds said, and he truly did. The operation was a success beyond command's expectations. Under Reynolds' leadership, the designated marksman squad provided crucial overwatch that allowed the main force to clear 3 villages of enemy presence with minimal friendly casualties. His ability to anticipate enemy movements, a skill learned directly from Coleman, saved lives on multiple occasions. When they returned to base 3 days later, exhausted but victorious, Reynolds went straight to the hospital to share the news with Coleman, only to find the bed empty. He was evacuated to Germany yesterday, the nurse informed him. His condition stabilized enough for transport, and they wanted him in a proper military hospital for his recovery. Reynolds felt a pang of loss. There had been no opportunity to say a proper goodbye to thank the man who had transformed his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Later that evening, he received a message that a package was waiting for him. Inside was Coleman's leather-bound journal, the one containing his combat experiences and hard-won wisdom, along with a handwritten note. Reynolds, by the time you read this, I'll be on my way back to the States. The doctors tell me I'll make a full recovery, but my days in the field are over. Perhaps that's as it should be. My generation's time has passed. It's your turn now. I've spoken with Colonel Wilson. The Warrior Legacy program is being expanded based on our success. When you return home, there will be a position waiting for you as an instructor if you want it. The chance to pass on what you've learned to the next generation. In this journal, you'll find the collected wisdom of 3 generations of warriors. My mentors, my own, and now yours. Add to it. Improve it. Then pass it on when you find someone worthy. Your father sends his regards. He's a proud man, but he's proud of you too in his own way. When you get back, take the time to talk with him. Really talk. You might be surprised what you learn. Remember, the true legacy of a warrior isn't measured in targets engaged or battles won. It's measured in the lives saved, both enemy and friendly, because you knew when to shoot and when to hold your fire. Carry on the legacy, son. I'll see you back home. Coleman. Reynolds closed the journal, running his hand over the worn leather cover. He thought about the journey that had begun with mockery of an old man and his ancient rifle. What had seemed laughable then had proven profound in the crucible of combat. 2 months later, as Delta Company prepared to return home, they gathered for a final formation at their forward operating base. Colonel Wilson stood before them, his uniform crisp despite the harsh conditions they had endured. Marines, you deployed to Afghanistan as a standard infantry company. You return home as something more, pioneers of an approach that combines the best of our military traditions with the advantages of modern technology. Your success has not gone unnoticed. He gestured to a plaque mounted on a simple stone monument. In recognition of Master Sergeant Coleman's contributions and to ensure his teachings endure, this forward operating base will henceforth be known as Combat Outpost. Coleman dedicated to the principle that while weapons may change, the warrior spirit remains constant. Reynolds, now wearing the insignia of his new rank, felt a swell of pride as the monument was unveiled. That evening, he began a letter to his father. Dad, in 2 days, we begin our journey home. It's been an experience I struggle to put into words, but I think you might understand better than most. Coleman told me about your emails. I wish you'd felt you could talk to me directly, but I understand why it might have been easier to go through him. He thinks highly of you, by the way. I know we've never really talked about your time in Iraq. Maybe you didn't think I was ready to understand, or maybe you weren't ready to share it. But I think I am now, and I hope you are too. When I get home, I'd like to hear your story if you're willing to share it. Not because I need to know, but because I think I'm finally ready to understand. And maybe in understanding, I can help carry some of that weight you've been bearing alone for too long. The legacy Coleman taught me about isn't just military tradition. It's about connections between warriors across generations, like the connection between you and me. A connection I hope we can strengthen when I return. See you soon, Jack. As Reynolds sealed the letter, he took out the 2 challenge coins he now carried, Coleman's, from Special Forces and his father's Bronze Star Medal. Together they represented something powerful. The unbroken line of warriors who had faced fear, made difficult choices, and passed their hard-won wisdom to those who followed. 3 weeks later, Reynolds stood in the arrival terminal at San Diego International Airport, scanning the crowd for his family. His mother he spotted immediately, waving excitedly. But it was the figure beside her that caught his attention. His father, standing straighter than Reynolds had seen in years, wearing a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap that he'd never displayed publicly before. As they embraced, Reynolds felt something different in his father's demeanor. A tension released, a barrier lowered. They had a long way to go, many conversations to have, but it was a start. Welcome home, son, Michael Reynolds said, his voice gruff with emotion. I got your letter. Thanks, Dad, Reynolds replied. We have a lot to talk about. Michael nodded. We do, and we will, but first there's someone waiting to see you. He pointed across the terminal, where a familiar figure sat in a wheelchair. Master Sergeant James Coleman, thinner than before but very much alive, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile as he spotted Reynolds. As Reynolds approached his mentor, he realized that the true mission was just beginning. The legacy entrusted to him wasn't just about marksmanship or tactics. It was about bridging generations, healing old wounds, and ensuring that hard-won wisdom was never lost. Coleman extended his hand, which Reynolds grasped firmly. Ready for the next phase of the mission, son? Reynolds nodded. Yes, Master Sergeant, I am. For in the end, the greatest weapon any warrior possesses isn't found in their hands, but in their hearts and minds, in the courage to face fear, the discipline to master themselves, and the wisdom to know when and why to act. That was the true warrior's legacy, passed down from generation to generation, as timeless as warfare itself. And as Reynolds stood there, connecting his father's generation to Coleman's, to his own, he understood that he was now not just a recipient of that legacy, but its guardian and teacher. The warrior's journey continued.